So imagine buying a $238 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, right? You lock the front door and you just, well, never step foot inside it.
Right. Which sounds crazy, but for years, New York City has basically just watched those empty mansions sit there.
Hmm.
I mean, they function as these massive glass and steel safety deposit boxes for the global elite.
Yeah, exactly. But facing a terrifying $5.4 billion fiscal cliff, the new mayor has decided that turning the city into your personal vault is, it's going to cost you.
Mm-hmm.
So, welcome to our deep dive. We're bringing you along as we unpack the intense math, the economic mechanics, and the high-stakes politics of surviving a municipal financial crisis.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
Really is. So Mayor Zohran Mamdani has just hit his first 100 days in office, and he inherited this massive budget deficit. To fix it, he's proposing sweeping new wealth taxes aimed at the top 1%. But at the same time, he's threatening a pretty brutal 9.5% property tax hike on the middle class if the state blocks him. And the whiplash doesn't stop at taxes either.
No, it really doesn't.
He's slashing a $17 billion housing program on one hand, while launching universal child care on the other.
We are looking at a masterclass in political and economic tension here. I mean, to understand how all these moving parts collide, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got a lot to go through.
We really do. We have financial blueprints from the city comptroller, think tank analyses from the Empire Center and the Partnership for New York City, plus urgent market data from real estate giant Douglas Elliman, and, the latest voter sentiment from Marist and Emerson polling.
Right, so the core mission of this deep dive is to figure out what happens when a major city tries to, aggressively balance its books in a post-pandemic world without triggering an economic exodus.
Well-
And to do that, we have to start at the very bottom of the hole. I mean, how does a city with an economy the size of a small country just find itself $5.4 billion in the red?
Well, according to City Controller Mark Levine, the money wasn't exactly lost. The deficit is basically the result of chronic structural under-budgeting by the previous administration.
Okay, under budgeting.
Yeah. Levine's office projects a $2.2 billion shortfall for fiscal year 2026, which then cascades into a massive $10.4 billion gap by 2027.
Wow. $10.4 billion.
Yeah, it's bad.
I'm looking at these controller reports, and I need to understand the mechanism here. How do you, under budget by billions of dollars and get away with it legally? Because cities are required to pass balanced budgets, right?
They are, yeah. But you can balance a budget on paper by artificially projecting that certain costs will be lower than they historically are.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So for years, the city has routinely underestimated these massive, fast-growing expenses, things like police and fire overtime, or the true operating costs of the shelter system.
Like just writing down a smaller number and hoping for the best.
Basically, if you write down that overtime will cost, say, $500 million, but the historical trend clearly shows it's going to cost $900 million, your budget looks perfectly balanced in July.
Right.
But by the time December rolls around, you have a massive cash shortfall. So Levine argues that that bill has simply come due, and, well, Mamdani is the one holding the checkbook now.
Which brings us back to that $238 million penthouse. Mamdani's first big swing to fill this budget hole is a partnership with Governor Kathy Hochul on something called the pay-to-tear tax.
Right, the anti-mansion tax.
Exactly.
This is a policy that housing advocates have floated for a decade, honestly. But it's finally moving from just a talking point to a serious legislative proposal. It specifically targets secondary homes valued at over $5 million that are owned by non-residents.
And the sources show this is incredibly popular, right? About 93% public support.
Oh yeah, massive support.
But how does the city actually enforce it? How do they prove a billionaire isn't actually living in their midtown penthouse?
That's the tricky part, but it comes down to tax domicile declarations and utility usage.
Utilities.
Yeah, the city cross-references primary residency claims on state and federal tax returns. So, if a property owner claims Florida as their primary residence for income tax purposes, but they own a $20 million apartment in Manhattan, that apartment gets flagged.
Oh, gotcha.
And the HEDI can also look at electricity and water usage. If a luxury condo uses the same amount of water as an empty broom closet over a 12-month period, it triggers the pied-à-terre surcharge.
Wow. Okay, so the administration projects this tax will pull in about $500 million annually. But, just doing the math, $500 million is barely 10% of a $5.4 billion deficit.
Yeah, it's a drop in the bucket.
It feels like throwing a cup of water on a house fire. Where does the other 90% of the money come from?
Well, that gap is the catalyst for Mamdani's broader wealth taxes. Because the empty mansions won't cover the bill, the administration is zeroing in on the city's highest earners and most profitable corporations.
Okay.
The proposal basically has two main pillars. First, bumping the state's top corporate tax rate from 7.25% up to 11.5%.
Which is a huge jump.
It is. That would tie New York with New Jersey for the highest corporate rate in the entire nation.
And a second pillar.
A massive jump in the personal income tax. He wants to raise the city income tax by a full 2 percentage points for individuals earning over $1 million a year.
Okay, so I'm reading the data from the Empire Center for Public Policy, and they are flashing red warning lights over this specific hike. They point out that New York's top earners already pay the highest non-federal income taxes in the country.
That's right. The current combined city and state top marginal rate in New York is 14.8%. If this 2% hike passes, it pushes the top rate to 16.8%. To put that in perspective, that would place New York a full 3.5 points higher than California, which is currently the second highest.
That just seems like an incredibly fragile strategy. I mean, the sources show the top 1% of earners already pay 40% of the city's total income tax.
Exactly.
Under this new plan, that small group share could jump to over 60%. It's less like balancing a budget and more like building a Jenga tower.
A Jenga tower, yeah, I like that.
Right, like the top 1% of earners are the 3 blocks at the very bottom holding up the entire city's tax base. If you apply too much pressure and just one of those blocks slides out to Florida, the remaining 99% suddenly feel the weight of the whole tower.
The Jenga tower metaphor is perfectly aligned with the warnings coming from the Partnership for New York City. We are seeing a massive ideological collision in the sources here. And just to be clear, we're not taking a side here. We're just laying out what the data and the different groups are arguing. Progressives are arguing that a 16.8% tax is a moral imperative, that the wealthiest must pay their fair share to fund vital city services that keep the economic engine running.
Right.
But on the flip side, the business sector's data insists this will cause a Jenga tower collapse through aggressive capital flight.
But I have to challenge the business sector's panic just a bit, playing devil's advocate. Are these Wall Street executives really going to pack up their trading floors and move to a beach in Miami just to save 2% on taxes? The financial infrastructure of New York is deeply, deeply entrenched.
You would think the infrastructure keeps them anchored, right?
Yeah.
But the IRS data shows the migration is already happening, and it actually accelerated during the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah. The share of income millionaires who choose to live in New York dropped from 12.7% of the national total in 2010 down to just 8.7% in 2022.
Oh, wow. That's a significant drop.
It is. And we aren't just talking about people buying a second home in Texas. We are seeing aggressive tax domicile audits where the state fights tooth and nail to prove these millionaires haven't severed ties with New York.
Right.
Furthermore, companies don't have to physically move their headquarters to trigger capital flight. They simply stop expanding their New York footprint. They shift new hires and wage growth to states with zero income tax.
So if the Jenga tower wobbles, if the state government blocks these wealth taxes, or if the billionaires successfully shield their income or just leave, who catches the bill, the city still has a $5.4 billion gap.
Well, the administration's backup parachute is to basically pull the cord on the middle class. Mamdani issued a stark ultimatum in his preliminary budget. If Albany doesn't approve the wealth taxes, he'll be forced to enact a 9.5% property tax hike and raid the city's financial reserves.
A 9.5% property tax hike in a single year.
That's wild. The median income for working-class New Yorkers is around, what, $122,000?
Roughly, yeah. But the immediate counterargument I always hear is, well, most people in New York City are renters, not homeowners. They don't pay property taxes.
Right. That is a very common misconception, and it is entirely false in practice. Real estate economics dictate that property taxes are operating costs. When a building's operating costs jump by 9.5%, Landlords do not absorb that hit out of the goodness of their hearts.
Obviously not.
No, they file for rent increases,
Yeah.
or they pass the costs through to tenants via lease renewals and major capital improvement surcharges.
So it filters directly down to the renter.
Inevitably, the average rent in New York City is currently sitting at $3,454 a month. A sudden spike in the underlying tax assessment translates to higher monthly costs for almost every working family in the 5 boroughs.
And Douglas Elliman real estate agents are pointing out that just floating this idea is causing chaos. I mean, markets thrive on predictability. If you're a prospective home buyer, you map out your mortgage, your maintenance fees, and your taxes for the next 10 years. Does the mere threat of a 9.5% hike freeze the economy?
It does. Real estate professionals have actually dubbed it the Mamdani effect.
The Mamdani effect.
Yeah. The threat alone has introduced deep uncertainty, causing a noticeable chill in transactions. Buyers are looking at their spreadsheets, seeing the potential liability of a massive tax penalty, and abruptly moving their searches across the city limits to Nassau and Westchester counties.
Which ironically shrinks the tax base even further.
Exactly.
The pushback to this threat was so intense, even from his own allies like Comptroller Levine, who called the property tax idea deeply regressive, that Mamdani has reportedly had to walk the threat back in private meetings.
It highlights a harsh reality, which is that raising revenue is incredibly difficult, which means to balance the budget, you also have to stop spending. And this is where the policy whiplash of his first 100 days becomes really fascinating.
Yeah, I am struggling with the math on his housing pivot, honestly. One of Mamdani's biggest campaign promises was expanding the city FHEP's rental assistance program to help more low-income residents avoid eviction. But he just blocked that expansion entirely. How does the administration justify that?
Well, it comes down to the underlying mechanism of what city FHEPs actually is. It isn't a fixed cost program like a grant. It's a voucher system that legally binds the city to cover the difference between what a tenant can afford and the actual market rent.
Oh, I see.
Right? And because market rents are skyrocketing, the liability to the city is virtually uncapped. Government estimates projected that expanding the program would add $17 billion in costs over the next 5 years.
$17 billion. Wow.
Yeah. So given the $5.4 billion deficit, the administration realized the structural math was simply unsustainable. He moved to settle a lawsuit from the previous administration to legally halt the expansion.
That is a massive blow to housing advocates. But here's the whiplash you mentioned. He cuts a $17 billion housing program, citing austerity, but then immediately turns around and drops $1.7 billion on universal childcare.
It is a profound shift in civic priorities. Partnering again with Governor Hochul, he's establishing universal childcare for 3-year-olds and free childcare for 2-year-olds across the city.
I mean, the cost of childcare in New York is effectively a second rent payment for young families, so you can see the logic. If you want to keep young professionals from fleeing to the suburbs, you subsidize the cost of raising children.
Exactly.
He's also launching city-run grocery stores, starting at La Marqueta in East Harlem, to physically intervene in food deserts.
Yeah, so you have these sweeping progressive social programs launching simultaneously with brutal, pragmatic budget cuts. And this intense recalibration extends far beyond the budget. The administration is fundamentally rewiring the city's approach to social issues and public space.
Right. Let's look at the homeless encampment sweeps. During the campaign, Mamdani was a fierce critic of the police clearing people off the streets. He paused the practice upon taking office.
He did, yes.
But a severe cold snap in February resulted in 20 tragic deaths on the streets, forcing a major reversal.
He reinstated the sweeps, but he changed the underlying mechanism of how the city conducts them. The process is no longer led by the NYPD. Instead, he shifted jurisdiction to the Department of Homeless Services.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The new protocol mandates advance notice and requires outreach workers to make daily visits to an encampment, attempting to transition individuals into shelters before any physical clearing takes place.
And we're seeing similar ideological shifts regarding international politics playing out at the municipal level, too. On his first day in office, Mamdani revoked several executive orders signed by former Mayor Eric Adams.
Specifically, he scrapped orders that prohibited city agencies from contracting with entities that boycott Israel, and he removed the city's official adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism.
Again, the sources show a massive ideological collision here, and we're just reporting what the sources say here, not taking a stance.
Right.
Some advocacy groups offered intense praise, arguing the previous executive order stifled free speech and political expression. But simultaneously, there was massive backlash from other sectors, including direct condemnation from the Israeli government, which labeled the revocation as anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's incredibly polarized. The administration's defense is that they remain fully committed to combating hate crimes, but believe the previous policy framework was flawed and legally problematic.
It's a perfect example of how polarized the environment is. Every decision, whether it involves a billion-dollar tax code or a single executive order, is placed under a microscope and heavily scrutinized by competing factions.
Oh, absolutely.
Which leads us to the ultimate question. After 100 days of tax threats, multi-billion-dollar program cuts, new childcare initiatives, and major ideological shifts, how are the voters processing all of this?
Well, the polling data reveals a highly fractured electorate. Emerson polling shows that 43% of voters approve of Mamdani's personal job performance.
Yeah.
However, a massive 59% say the city is generally on the wrong track.
That's a fascinating psychological disconnect. They seem to like him as a leader, but they are deeply anxious about the trajectory of the city.
When you drill down into specific policies, you see why. The child care initiative is incredibly popular. 54% of voters approve of how he's handling that issue. There's also a majority support, about 55%, for his attempts to raise state taxes on the wealthy. But when pollsters ask about his overall management of the budget and the deficit, the consensus completely shatters. 40% approve and 37% disapprove.
It makes complete sense, though. I mean, people love universal childcare, and they generally love the idea of taxing billionaires. But when you threaten their rent with a 9.5% property tax hike because the math isn't adding up, that anxiety just spikes.
It's the ultimate municipal tightrope. You have to generate enough capital to provide the massive social services a modern city demands without squeezing the golden goose so hard that it flies to Florida.
So bringing all these threads together, we're watching a new administration try to engineer its way out of a $5.4 billion hole. They're betting they can aggressively tax the wealthiest residents and corporations without triggering a Jenga tower collapse of the tax base. And if they're wrong, the backup plan places the financial burden squarely on the shoulders of working-class renters through property tax ripple effects.
And looking at this through a wider lens, the sources force us to consider the long-term viability of this entire economic model.
Yeah, and here's something for you to chew on that goes beyond just New York's borders. If New York City's wealth actually does scatter, if the Jenga tower falls, it doesn't just impact local subway funding and sanitation. New York generates a massive, disproportionate share of the entire country's federal tax revenue.
That is a crucial point. The wealth concentrated in the city subsidizes federal programs across the entire nation.
Exactly. So are we just watching a localized budget dispute, or are we watching the beginning of a national economic realignment? If remote work and tax domicile auditing permanently shift the gravity away from traditional urban centers, does the capital of the world slowly become just another regional player?
It is a scenario that mayors and federal economists alike are watching very, very closely.
It changes the entire math of how America functions. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll keep tracking the numbers as the story develops.